16-year-old Emma had no idea that October evening would be her last. The former teacher who offered her and her best friend a ride home from the high school dance seemed trustworthy enough. Just Mr. Coleman, their old 8th grade English instructor, who'd always been so kind and helpful. But Emma never made it home that night. Her bicycle was found 3 days later, abandoned in Millerville Park, with her backpack still strapped to the handlebars. For 8 agonizing months, the small town of Millerville, Tennessee, searched empty fields and chased phantom leads. Then came the discovery that changed everything. In a remote patch of woodland outside town, searchers uncovered Emma's remains. But 20 yards away lay something even more shocking, another body buried for much longer. Beth, missing since 1985. 2 teenage girls, different decades, same killer. The investigation revealed a pattern so terrifying that even seasoned detectives struggled to sleep. One man had been hiding in plain sight for years, collecting victims like a twisted teacher collecting essays. The question wasn't just who, but how many more were there? Before we dive into this story, drop a comment with your country and what time it is right now. The cool October air of 1990 carried music and laughter through the open doors of Millerville High School gymnasium. Emma moved across the dance floor with easy grace, her blonde hair catching the colored lights as friends called her name. At 16, she possessed that particular brightness of youth, the kind that made people believe every day held infinite possibility. The Halloween dance buzzed with typical small-town energy. Orange and black decorations hung from the ceiling, and costumed teenagers clustered around tables laden with homemade treats brought by parent volunteers. Emma checked the clock above the gym doors, 9:30 p.m. Her parents expected her home by 10:30. "Em!" A voice cut through the music. She turned to see her best friend Jamie approaching, slightly out of breath from dancing. At 15, Jamie was quieter than Emma, more studious, the kind of girl who helped teachers after school and never missed a homework assignment. "My dad's running late to pick us up," Jamie said, adjusting her costume. She'd come dressed as a witch, complete with pointed hat. "He got held up at work again." Emma glanced around the gym. Most of her classmates had their own rides arranged, and the dance was winding down anyway. She was about to suggest they call her parents when a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Girls, how was the dance?" Both teenagers turned to see Mr. Robert Coleman approaching through the crowd of departing students. Their former English teacher looked the same as always, wire-rimmed glasses, cardigan sweater, that gentle smile that had made him popular with students and parents alike during his years at Millerville Middle School. Coleman had left his teaching position the previous year under circumstances that remained somewhat unclear to the students. The official story was early retirement, but there had been whispers, parent complaints, administrative concerns, something about inappropriate behavior that had never been fully explained. "Mr. Coleman," Emma smiled genuinely, always happy to see her former favorite teacher. "The dance was great. We had so much fun." "I'm sure you did," Coleman replied warmly. "Heading home now?" "Yeah, we're just waiting for my dad," Jamie said. "He's running a bit late." Coleman adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. "You know, I was just driving by and saw all the cars here. If you need a ride, I'd be happy to drop you both off. Save your father the trip on such a busy night." Emma and Jamie exchanged glances. It was a reasonable offer from someone they trusted completely. Coleman had been their favorite teacher in 8th grade. Patient, encouraging, always willing to stay after school to help struggling students. "That's really nice of you to offer," Emma said. "Are you sure it's not too much trouble?" "Not at all," Coleman assured them, already walking toward the exit. "My car's right outside." As they followed their former teacher across the parking lot, neither girl noticed how empty the school had become, or how Coleman's hands trembled slightly as he unlocked his sedan. The autumn night was growing colder, and both girls pulled their light jackets tighter as they climbed into Coleman's car. Emma took the passenger seat, while Jamie settled into the back, still wearing her witch hat. "So, what have you both been up to this year?" Coleman asked conversationally as he started the engine. "Still keeping up with your reading?" They chatted easily as Coleman pulled out of the school parking lot. Emma told him about her classes and her part-time job at the local diner. Jamie mentioned she was thinking about applying to colleges next year, maybe studying to become a teacher herself. But instead of turning toward their neighborhood, Coleman headed in the opposite direction, toward the rural roads that led away from Millerville's small downtown area. "Where are we going?" Jamie asked from the back seat, finally noticing their route. "Oh, I just need to make a quick stop at my place first," Coleman explained casually. "I left some papers there that I need to drop off at the school tomorrow. Won't take more than a few minutes." Emma looked out the passenger window at the unfamiliar countryside rolling past. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. This wasn't the way to Coleman's house, at least not the address that had been in the school directory. But he'd always been trustworthy, hadn't he? He'd been their favorite teacher, the one who'd encouraged Emma's writing and helped Jamie with her confidence in public speaking. Surely everything was fine. The morning of October 31st arrived with brutal clarity. Jamie's father stood in his kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared at the clock. 7 in the morning, then 7:30. Jamie's bed hadn't been slept in, and her phone calls went straight to a busy signal. The phone was off the hook. The Henderson family had always been close-knit, the kind of household where people checked in with each other regularly. Jamie's absence felt wrong in a way that made her father's stomach clench with increasing worry. He called Emma's house. Mrs. Patterson answered on the 4th ring, her voice already tight with concern. "David, thank God you called," she said. "Emma never came home last night either. I've been calling around since 6 this morning." By 8 o'clock, the worry had crystallized into something sharper. Both families gathered at the Patterson house, having spent the morning making frantic calls. Emma's mother emerged from her daughter's bedroom, having searched through drawers and closets for any clue about where the girls might have gone. "Did you try calling the school?" Jamie's father asked, though he knew it was Halloween. No classes today. 3 times, Emma's father replied. The custodian said the building was locked up tight after the dance ended at 10. All the kids were gone by 10:15. The normal sounds of Halloween morning continued outside. Children's voices planning trick-or-treat routes, neighbors decorating their porches, life proceeding as if nothing had changed. But inside the Patterson house, time seemed suspended in that terrible space between worry and panic. "We need to call the police," Emma's mother said finally. The words neither family wanted to speak had been spoken. As Emma's father dialed the Millerville Police Department, his hands trembled slightly. He'd always imagined missing person reports were for other families, other daughters who made different choices. The dispatcher's calm, professional voice asked for details that suddenly seemed inadequate to convey the magnitude of their fear. Within an hour, 2 officers stood in their living room, notebooks ready, asking questions that transformed their daughters from people into cases. When were they last seen? Who were they with? Did they have a history of staying out all night? Any recent problems or conflicts? Each question felt like a small betrayal of the girls' memories, as if they were already speaking of them in the past tense. The police moved with practiced efficiency, but to both families, everything felt simultaneously urgent and impossibly slow. Detective Linda Hayes from the Millerville Police Department arrived within 2 hours of the initial report. Her calm demeanor provided the first sense that their case was being taken seriously. "We're going to start with the girls' known activities from last night," Detective Hayes explained, settling into their living room with a notepad. "I need you to walk me through everyone they might have been in contact with at the dance." Both sets of parents pulled out their phones, scrolling through contacts they'd already called that morning. Each name felt like a prayer. Maybe this person would have the answer, the simple explanation that would bring their daughters home safely. The Halloween dance became the focal point. Detective Hayes took detailed notes as they reconstructed the girls' evening. Classmates were contacted and recontacted. The few photos from the dance were examined for any clue about who the girls might have left with. By afternoon, a pattern began to emerge from witness statements. Several students remembered seeing Emma and Jamie talking with an adult near the gym exit around 9:30. Though accounts differed on details, most described the man as older, wearing glasses, someone who seemed to know the girls well. "Did either of your daughters mention anyone who might have offered them a ride home?" Detective Hayes asked. Emma's mother suddenly straightened. Jamie's father was supposed to pick them up, but he was running late from work. Emma mentioned they might need to find another way home. The realization hit both families like a physical blow. Their responsible, careful daughters had accepted help from someone they trusted, someone who had seemed safe. But who had they trusted enough to leave the dance with on a Halloween night? And where were Emma and Jamie now? November the 2nd dawned gray and overcast, matching the mood that had settled over the search efforts. Detective Hayes received the call just after dawn. A jogger had found something in Millerville Park that might be connected to the missing girls. The scene was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Emma's pink mountain bike lay on its side near the park's old wooden bridge, her black backpack still strapped to the handlebars. The bike's chain had come off, and mud caked the wheels, suggesting it had been there for days. Crime scene technicians worked methodically around the bicycle, photographing every angle and collecting what little evidence might have survived 2 days of autumn weather. The location was isolated, the kind of place someone would choose if they wanted to abandon evidence without being observed. Detective Hayes stood beside the bike, feeling the weight of what this discovery meant for both families. She'd handled missing person cases before, but something about these responsible teenagers and the deliberate placement of the bicycle felt particularly ominous. Her radio crackled with updates from the investigation team. Officers were canvassing the neighborhood around the park, asking residents if they'd seen or heard anything unusual on Halloween night. So far, the responses had been frustratingly vague. The drive back to inform the families was the worst part of Detective Hayes' job. She'd done it before, but delivering news that transformed hope into fear never got easier. Both families deserved to know about the bicycle, even though it raised more questions than it answered. When she arrived at the Patterson house, both families were gathered in what had become their command center. Maps covered the kitchen table, phones charged on every surface, and photos of Emma and Jamie watched over everything from the refrigerator. "We found Emma's bicycle," Detective Hayes began, and watched as the last fragments of normal worry died in their eyes. The news spread quickly through Millerville's tight-knit community. Local media picked up the story, transforming Emma and Jamie from missing persons into presumed victims. Their case joined the grim statistics of teenagers who vanished under suspicious circumstances. That evening, the first candlelight vigil was held in the park, where the bicycle was found, drawing hundreds of people who had never met the girls, but felt compelled to stand together against the darkness that had touched their small town. The days following the discovery brought an intensity to the investigation that both families found overwhelming. Detective Hayes briefed them regularly, explaining how the case was expanding beyond Millerville's small police force as evidence pointed to something more sinister than teenage runaways. Media attention escalated quickly. Emma and Jamie's story resonated with viewers who saw their own daughters in the smiling school photos that appeared on television screens across Tennessee. Their parents found themselves thrust into the unfamiliar role of public advocates for their missing children. By now, a pattern was emerging from witness interviews. Several students from the Halloween dance remembered seeing both girls talking with an adult man near the gymnasium exit. The descriptions were maddeningly vague. Older, wearing glasses, someone who seemed to know the girls well. Can you think of any adult male who both girls would have trusted enough to accept a ride from? Detective Hayes asked during one of her daily briefings with the families. Emma's mother suddenly went very still. There was Mr. Coleman, she said quietly, their 8th grade English teacher. He left the school district last year, but both girls always spoke so highly of him. The name Robert Coleman meant nothing to Detective Hayes yet, but she could see recognition dawning in both sets of parents' faces. Within hours, she would learn why that recognition filled them with such dread. What had really happened to Emma and Jamie on Halloween night? And where were they now? Detective Hayes spread Coleman's personnel file across her desk, studying every detail of his employment history and the circumstances surrounding his departure from Millerville Middle School. The file painted a disturbing picture that made her jaw tighten with each page she turned. Multiple complaints from parents about inappropriate one-on-one meetings with students. Reports of Coleman asking personal questions about children's home lives and family schedules. Most troubling of all, 3 separate incidents where female students had reported feeling uncomfortable during after-school tutoring sessions. The school board forced him into early retirement rather than face a formal investigation, Hayes told Officer Martinez as he joined her at the desk. They gave him a pension package to leave quietly. Martinez shook his head in disgust. And now he's escalated to kidnapping. You got anything on his current address? That's the problem, Hayes replied, pulling out another document. His official address is a post office box in Nashville. No residential listing anywhere in Millerville. It's like he deliberately went off the grid after leaving the school. The phone on her desk rang, and Hayes grabbed it immediately. Detective Hayes. Ma'am, this is Officer Johnson. We found Coleman's old sedan abandoned about 10 miles east of town, near the State Forest access road. Hayes felt her pulse quicken. Any sign of the girls? No, ma'am, but we found something else. There are tire tracks leading away from the car toward a logging road. Looks like Coleman switched vehicles. While the police search expanded across the rural areas surrounding Millerville, Emma and Jamie were experiencing their first days in Coleman's isolated cabin. The former teacher had been methodical in his preparation, choosing a location deep in the Tennessee woods where screams would never be heard. Coleman had developed a routine over the years. New victims required a breaking-in period, systematic isolation, psychological manipulation, and careful conditioning designed to destroy their sense of hope and replace it with complete dependence on their captor. The key to effective education, Coleman explained during one of his visits to the girls' makeshift prison, is understanding that every student learns differently. Some respond well to gentle guidance. Others require more intensive instruction. Emma pressed herself against the far wall of the small storage room where they were being held. She could hear Jamie crying softly in the darkness beside her, both girls' hands bound with rope that cut into their wrists. "What do you want from us?" Emma whispered, surprised by how weak her own voice sounded after 2 days without proper food or water. Coleman smiled that same gentle smile he'd used in the classroom, the expression that had once made students feel safe and valued. "I want you to learn, Emma, to understand your place in the world, to accept that your old life is over, and embrace the education I'm offering you." Back at the police station, Detective Hayes was coordinating with state authorities. The discovery of Coleman's abandoned car had triggered a multi-agency response, with search teams deploying across 3 counties of dense Tennessee forest. But Coleman had chosen his hiding place carefully. The old hunting cabin was buried in property records under multiple ownership transfers, and its remote location made it invisible to casual searches. He'd spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. As the autumn afternoon wore on, Coleman made his rounds with methodical precision. He paused outside the storage room where both girls were held, listening to their whispered conversations about escape plans that would never work. "Rest well, girls," Coleman called through the heavy wooden door. "Tomorrow, your real education begins." In the darkness of their prison, Both teenagers tried to process the reality of their situation. Above them, search helicopters swept across the Tennessee countryside with powerful spotlights, coming within miles of the cabin, but never quite close enough. Time was running out, and Coleman was preparing to begin the next phase of his terrifying curriculum. Detective Hayes drove through the early November rain to interview Rebecca Wilson, a former colleague of Coleman's at Millerville Middle School. Wilson had agreed to meet after seeing the news coverage about Emma and Jamie's disappearance, though she'd seemed reluctant on the phone. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, away from the gossip network that had consumed Millerville since the girls went missing. Wilson, now in her 50s, looked nervous as she stirred sugar into her coffee for the third time. "I should have spoken up years ago," Wilson began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you know how these things are in small towns. You don't want to believe the worst about someone you work with every day." Hayes leaned forward, notepad ready. "Tell me what you observed about Robert Coleman." "It was subtle at first," Wilson explained. "He'd always volunteer to stay after school with struggling students, especially the girls. Said he was just being helpful, and the administration praised him for his dedication." She paused, staring into her coffee cup. "But I noticed patterns. He'd specifically choose girls from broken homes, single mothers, parents who worked multiple jobs, kids who didn't have a lot of supervision at home." Hayes felt a chill run down her spine. This matched exactly what they'd learned about Emma and Jamie, both from families where parents worked demanding schedules. "What else did you notice?" "He kept detailed files on students that went far beyond academic records," Wilson continued. "Home addresses, parent work schedules, family situations. He claimed it helped him understand each child's needs better." The rain drummed against the diner windows as Wilson revealed more disturbing details. Coleman had a habit of giving special assignments to certain female students that required them to stay after school alone with him. When other teachers questioned this practice, he'd become defensive and cite his excellent student evaluation scores. "There was one girl in particular," Wilson said, her voice dropping even lower. "Beth Morrison. This was back in 1985. She was in Coleman's class and she just disappeared one day in the spring. Her family said she'd run away, but Beth wasn't the type. She was quiet, responsible, a lot like your missing girls." Hayes felt her pulse quicken. "What happened to Beth?" "They never found her. The family eventually moved away, couldn't handle the whispers and speculation. But I always wondered." Wilson trailed off, then looked directly at Hayes. "Coleman took a sudden leave of absence right around the time Beth disappeared. Said he needed to deal with a family emergency, but he was back the following school year, like nothing had happened." After the interview, Hayes drove straight to the station and pulled Beth Morrison's missing person file from 1985. The similarities to Emma and Jamie's case were striking. A responsible teenage girl who vanished without a trace, last seen at a school function. The investigation team worked through the night, cross-referencing Coleman's employment history with missing person reports from surrounding counties. What they found painted a terrifying picture of a predator who had been perfecting his methods for years. Between 1982 and 1989, at least 4 teenage girls had disappeared from towns where Coleman had taught or substitute taught. All were described as quiet, responsible students from families with limited supervision. All had vanished near school events or activities. By dawn, Detective Hayes had enough evidence to issue an arrest warrant for Robert Coleman on suspicion of kidnapping. But first, they had to find him, and hopefully, find Emma and Jamie alive. The manhunt was about to expand beyond anything Millerville had ever seen. But would they locate Coleman's hiding place before it was too late for the missing girls? November and December passed in a blur of false leads and frustrated hope. Detective Hayes and her expanded team pursued every tip, no matter how remote. Phone records were analyzed, security footage reviewed from every business in a 50-mile radius, and known associates of Coleman were interviewed and re-interviewed. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise to what had clearly become a complex multi-jurisdictional case. Special Agent Rodriguez worked closely with local law enforcement, coordinating efforts across 3 states as the investigation expanded beyond Tennessee's borders. Emma and Jamie's families established routines that helped them cope with the terrible uncertainty. Both sets of parents took turns organizing weekend search parties, while also working with police on the technical aspects of the investigation. Their marriages, tested by grief and stress, found strength in their shared determination to find answers. The media attention began to fade as other stories captured public interest. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect for both families, watching their daughters' cases slip from front-page news to occasional updates buried in the back sections of newspapers. Coleman's legal situation had become increasingly precarious. Multiple arrest warrants had been issued, but he seemed to have vanished completely. His pension checks went unclaimed, his known associates claimed ignorance of his whereabouts, and every lead seemed to evaporate into the Tennessee wilderness. The investigation team grew smaller as other cases demanded attention, but Detective Hayes refused to let Emma and Jamie's case go cold. She reviewed the files daily, looking for connections or evidence that might have been overlooked in the initial urgency of the search. Community support remained strong despite the media's waning attention. Local businesses displayed the girls' photos, and missing person flyers remained posted throughout Millerville. The small town had been changed by their disappearance, bound together by shared tragedy and determination. December brought a different kind of pain to both families. The holidays, which had always been times of joy and connection, now served as stark reminders of Emma and Jamie's absence. Their empty chairs at Christmas dinner felt like physical weights in both homes. Both families decided to hold a joint Christmas vigil for the girls, inviting the community to join them in prayer and remembrance. Despite the cold weather and falling snow, hundreds of people gathered in Millerville Park, holding candles and sharing memories of Emma and Jamie's bright spirits. Detective Hayes attended the vigil, standing at the back of the crowd and watching the faces illuminated by candlelight. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They kept the girls' cases in the public consciousness while providing emotional support for their families. But they also sometimes attracted people with information who hadn't previously come forward. Emma's mother spoke to the gathering, her voice clear despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her words. Emma and Jamie would want us to keep believing, she said. They would want us to keep fighting for the truth, no matter how long it takes. The investigation continued during the holiday break, though at a reduced pace. Phone tips still came in regularly, most of them well-meaning, but ultimately unhelpful. People reported seeing the girls in distant cities or claimed to have information about Coleman's activities, but none of these leads produced substantive evidence. As 1990 drew to a close, Emma and Jamie's case remained officially active, but practically stalled. Their parents faced the new year with a mixture of determination and despair, knowing that each passing day made it less likely their daughters would be found alive. But somewhere in the Tennessee wilderness, Coleman was still out there with his captives, and time was running out for everyone involved. The new year of 1991 brought renewed energy to Emma and Jamie's case, partly due to their family's refusal to let the investigation fade into bureaucratic routine. Both sets of parents had become effective advocates, working with missing person organizations and learning to navigate the complex relationships between local police, federal investigators, and prosecutors' offices. Detective Hayes used the fresh calendar year as an opportunity to reassess the case from the beginning. She spread the girls' files across her desk: photographs, witness statements, phone records, forensic reports. and tried to see patterns that might have been missed in the initial intensity of the investigation. New tips continued to come in, many triggered by anniversary coverage of Emma and Jamie's disappearance. Some callers claimed to have seen suspicious activity in rural areas around Millerville. Others provided information about Coleman's behavior in the months following the girl's disappearance. The investigation team decided to expand their search area, focusing on locations where someone might dispose of evidence or remains. This meant coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies and organizing search parties that could cover vast stretches of Tennessee wilderness. Jamie's father took on the role of liaison with volunteer search groups. His methodical nature helped organize efforts that might otherwise have been chaotic. He studied topographical maps, coordinated with landowners for permission to search private property, and maintained detailed records of areas that had been covered. The media attention around Emma and Jamie's case had an unexpected side effect. It brought renewed attention to Beth Morrison's disappearance from 1985. Families of other missing girls began reaching out to the Pattersons and Hendersons, creating an informal network of people united by tragedy and determination. Prosecutors continued to review the evidence against Coleman, looking for ways to build a case that could withstand the scrutiny of trial. The circumstantial nature of the evidence was problematic, but not insurmountable if more pieces could be added to the puzzle. February brought the worst winter storm in recent memory, effectively halting search efforts for nearly 2 weeks. The weather seemed to conspire against their efforts, adding another layer of frustration to an already difficult situation. Despite the setbacks, both families maintained their weekly vigils and continued their media appearances. They had learned that keeping Emma and Jamie's story in the public consciousness was crucial to generating new leads and maintaining pressure on investigators. March 1991 arrived with the promise of spring and a breakthrough that would change everything. A group of volunteer searchers working in remote woodland, about 30 miles east of Millerville, made a discovery that sent shock waves through the investigation. Human remains, partially buried and weathered by months of exposure, were found in an isolated clearing that had been searched before, but not with the methodical care that this volunteer group had applied. Initial observations suggested the remains had been in place for several months. Detective Hayes received the call on a Tuesday afternoon that would haunt her for years to come. The remains appeared to be those of a young female, found in an area that had been searched before, but not with the methodical care that the volunteer group had applied. Initial observations suggested the remains had been in place for several months, consistent with Emma and Jamie's disappearance timeline. The forensic team arrived within hours, cordoning off a large area around the discovery site. Dr. Patricia Williams, the county's chief medical examiner, supervised the careful excavation of the remains and the surrounding soil. Every fragment was preserved and cataloged for analysis. The call to both families was delayed until preliminary identification could be attempted. Detective Hayes wanted to be as certain as possible before subjecting the parents to what might be another false hope. Dental records were requested and compared with the skeletal remains. By evening, the match was confirmed. The remains found in the Tennessee woodland were those of Emma Patterson. The 16-year-old who had vanished after the Halloween dance had finally been found, but not in the way her family had prayed for. The news broke on local television that night, ending months of uncertainty with the cruelest possible answer. Emma's parents received the notification in person from Detective Hayes, who sat with them as they processed the reality that their daughter was never coming home. The discovery site became a focal point for renewed forensic investigation. The woodland clearing where Emma's remains were found was treated as an active crime scene, with investigators looking for any evidence that might have been preserved alongside her body. What they found nearby changed the trajectory of the case entirely. A second set of remains was discovered approximately 30 yards from Emma's body, these showing signs of having been in place much longer. Initial analysis suggested these remains might belong to another young female, someone who had been missing for years rather than months. The possibility that Emma's case was connected to other disappearances gave the investigation new urgency and complexity. Two families were about to learn that their worst fears had been realized. The identification of the second set of remains took longer, but the outcome was equally devastating. Dental records confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The bones belonged to Beth Morrison, the 17-year-old who had vanished in 1985. Beth's mother, who had spent 6 years searching for her daughter, received the news with a mixture of grief and relief. The uncertainty that had defined her life was finally over, though the answers came at a price she had never wanted to pay. The discovery of both bodies in the same isolated woodland was more than coincidental. It established a clear pattern and provided investigators with the strongest evidence yet of Coleman's involvement in both disappearances. The geographical connection between the cases created a narrative that prosecutors could present to a jury. Dr. Williams worked carefully to extract whatever forensic evidence the remains might provide. The condition of Emma's body, having been exposed to the elements for 5 months, limited the analysis that could be performed. Beth's remains, after 6 years, offered even fewer clues about the circumstances of her death. Still, the forensic team was able to determine that both young women had died violently. The positioning of the remains and evidence of trauma to the bones suggested neither death had been accidental or from natural causes. But one crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Jamie? If Coleman had taken both girls on Halloween night, why had only Emma's body been found in this location? The media response was immediate and intense. The discovery of both bodies created a sensation that reached beyond Tennessee, drawing national attention to what had clearly become a serial case. Emma and Beth's photographs appeared side by side on news broadcasts, two young women whose lives had been cut short by the same predator. Coleman's legal situation changed dramatically with the discovery of the remains. What had been a missing person case was now a double homicide investigation, and prosecutors began preparing their strategy for bringing formal charges. The community response was equally intense. The knowledge that 2 teenage girls had been murdered and their bodies hidden in the Tennessee woods created a fear that seemed to touch every family in Millerville. Parents questioned whether their children were safe, and longtime residents wondered how such violence had remained hidden for so long. Emma's parents found themselves navigating grief while also serving as advocates for both their daughter and Beth. The families had been brought together by tragedy, united in their determination to see justice served. But one crucial question haunted everyone involved. Where was Jamie Henderson? The weeks following the discovery of both bodies brought a flurry of investigative activity. Detective Hayes coordinated with multiple agencies as the case expanded to encompass 2 homicides spanning 6 years. The FBI's involvement intensified, with federal investigators bringing additional resources to what had clearly become a complex serial case. Beth Morrison's disappearance from 1985 was re-examined with fresh eyes and new forensic techniques. Evidence that had been collected at the time was retested using advances in DNA analysis and trace evidence processing that hadn't been available 6 years earlier. The connection between Emma and Beth through Coleman created a timeline of violence that prosecutors found compelling. Beth had been trying to avoid Coleman's inappropriate attention when she vanished. Emma's encounter with him at the Halloween dance appeared to have triggered a similar violent response. Media coverage intensified as reporters delved into Coleman's background and history of inappropriate relationships with students. Former colleagues came forward with stories of boundary violations and threatening behavior that painted a picture of escalating violence over many years. The public's fascination with the case created both opportunities and challenges for investigators. Tips poured in from people who claimed to have information about Coleman's activities during the relevant time periods. Most of these tips proved irrelevant, but some provided useful background information about his behavior and associations. Emma's parents struggled with the transition from hoping for their daughter's safe return to seeking justice for her murder. The discovery of her body had ended the uncertainty, but it had also transformed their grief into something sharper and more focused. Community vigils took on a different character now that the search for Emma was over. The gatherings became memorials for both young women, with speakers calling for justice and action to prevent similar tragedies. The local government promised increased funding for school safety programs and improved training for law enforcement officers. Coleman's former colleagues at Millerville Middle School faced intense scrutiny as investigators questioned why the warning signs had been ignored for so long. The school board's decision to quietly force Coleman into retirement, rather than pursue formal charges, now seemed tragically short-sighted. But still, one question remained unanswered. If Coleman had taken both girls on Halloween night, why had only Emma's body been found with Beth's remains? Was Jamie still alive somewhere, or had Coleman disposed of her body in a different location entirely? April 1991 brought the break investigators had been desperately seeking. A tip came in from an unexpected source, Coleman's elderly aunt in Nashville, who had been following the news coverage and wrestling with her conscience for weeks. "He's been staying at the old hunting cabin," she told Detective Hayes over the phone, her voice shaking. "Up in the Smoky Mountains, near the old logging road. My late husband used to take him there when he was a boy." The cabin was remote, accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound through dense Tennessee forest. It had been in Coleman's family for decades, but the property records were so old and convoluted that it had never appeared in any database searches. Within hours, a joint task force of local police, state troopers, and FBI agents surrounded the isolated structure. Through binoculars, they could see movement inside, shadows passing by dirty windows, the flicker of kerosene lanterns in the growing dusk. Detective Hayes coordinated the approach with tactical precision. They had one chance to do this right, and everyone knew that lives hung in the balance. If Jamie was still alive after 6 months of captivity, her condition would be critical. The assault team moved at dawn, using the morning mist as cover. They found Coleman's truck parked behind the cabin, confirming their target was inside. But as they breached the front door, they discovered something that chilled them to the bone. The cabin's main room had been converted into a makeshift classroom, complete with a blackboard, student desks, and educational posters yellowed with age. Chains and restraints were bolted to the floor, where students would normally sit. Coleman was found in the back bedroom, calmly grading papers, as if nothing unusual was happening. He offered no resistance as officers placed him in handcuffs, maintaining the same gentle demeanor that had once made parents trust him with their children. "Where is Jamie Henderson?" Detective Hayes demanded as they led Coleman outside. Coleman adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and smiled that familiar teacher's smile. "She graduated to a different kind of lesson," he said quietly. "Some students require more intensive education than others." The search of the cabin revealed evidence of Coleman's crimes spanning nearly a decade. Photographs of his victims, detailed journals documenting their progress, and personal items taken as trophies. But Jamie herself was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the forensics team examined the cabin's basement that they discovered the full horror of Coleman's classroom. Hidden beneath a false floor were additional remains, not just Jamie, but other young victims whose disappearances had never been connected to the former teacher. Jamie's body was found alongside those of 3 other teenage girls, all students Coleman had taught in different school districts over the years. The basement had been his final examination room, where his twisted curriculum reached its deadly conclusion. The discovery revealed the true scope of Coleman's crimes: at least 7 young victims over 8 years, all carefully selected and methodically destroyed by a predator who had hidden behind the trusted facade of education. But one question remained that would haunt investigators for years to come. How many other classrooms had Coleman operated, and how many victims were still waiting to be found? By fall 1991, prosecutors felt confident they had sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges against Robert Coleman. The grand jury proceedings were conducted in secrecy, but the outcome was announced with considerable fanfare. Coleman was indicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Emma, Jamie, Beth, and 4 other young victims whose remains had been found at his various classrooms. The arrest took place on a gray October morning, with media crews positioned outside the courthouse as Coleman was led inside in handcuffs. The sight of him in custody provided all the families with their first tangible sense that justice might finally be served. Detective Hayes had worked on the case for nearly a year, and seeing Coleman charged with multiple murders represented both a personal and professional victory. The investigation had tested her skills and dedication, but the evidence they had assembled told a compelling story of premeditated violence spanning nearly a decade. The legal process that followed would be lengthy and complex. Murder trials often take years to reach completion, especially in cases involving multiple victims and extensive forensic evidence. All the families prepared themselves for a long journey through the criminal justice system. Emma's parents found that the arrest brought both relief and renewed anxiety. They were gratified that the case was moving forward, but they also understood that a trial would mean reliving the worst moments of their daughter's disappearance and death in a public forum. Jamie's father, who had waited months for this moment, felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. The arrest validated his belief that his daughter had been murdered, but it also confirmed that Jamie had died violently at the hands of someone she had once trusted. Beth's mother, who had waited 6 years for answers, finally saw hope that her daughter's killer would face justice. The connection to Coleman explained so many questions that had haunted her since 1985. Public reaction to the arrest was overwhelmingly positive, with many Millerville residents expressing relief that the suspected killer was finally in custody. The case had created an atmosphere of fear that affected how parents supervised their children and how young women navigated social situations. Coleman's legal team immediately began challenging the evidence and questioning the validity of the charges. They argued that the prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence rather than concrete proof of their client's guilt. The media coverage of the arrest was extensive, with reporters examining Coleman's background and the evidence that had led to his indictment. Emma, Jamie, and Beth's stories were told and retold, ensuring that their memories remained in the public consciousness. Coleman maintained his calm demeanor throughout the proceedings, occasionally smiling that same gentle teacher's smile that had once made students feel safe. Even in custody, he seemed to believe he had been conducting legitimate educational work. The community of Millerville began the long process of healing, though many residents would never feel entirely safe again. The knowledge that such evil had hidden behind the trusted facade of education had shaken their faith in institutions they had once considered sacred. But as the legal machinery ground forward toward trial, one question remained that would determine Coleman's ultimate fate. Would a jury believe that this mild-mannered former teacher was capable of the systematic torture and murder of innocent children? March 1993 finally brought the beginning of the trial that all the families had awaited for nearly 2 years. The courthouse in Nashville was packed with media representatives, family members, and community members who wanted to witness the conclusion of one of Tennessee's most notorious cases. Jury selection took several days, with both sides carefully questioning potential jurors about their knowledge of the case and their ability to remain impartial despite extensive media coverage. The selected jury included people from various backgrounds, all expressing confidence in their ability to focus on the evidence presented in court. Judge William Thompson presided over the proceedings with the gravity that such a significant case demanded. He had handled multiple high-profile trials during his career, but the emotional weight of this serial murder case was evident in his careful management of courtroom procedures. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by District Attorney Patricia Morris, laid out a clear narrative of violence spanning nearly a decade. She described Coleman as a man whose position of trust had allowed him to prey on vulnerable students for years. Emma Patterson, Jamie Henderson, Beth Morrison, and 4 other innocent young women died because they made the tragic mistake of trusting their former teacher, Morris told the jury. The evidence will show that Robert Coleman systematically selected, abducted, and murdered these children over the course of 8 years. The defense's opening statement, delivered by attorney David Walsh, focused on challenging the forensic evidence and questioning the reliability of witness testimony. He argued that while the deaths were tragic, the prosecution's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. Emma's parents sat in the front row of the courtroom, holding hands as they listened to their daughter's final days being discussed in legal terms. The formal language of the justice system seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of their loss. Jamie's father sat nearby, having waited over 2 years for this moment. The trial represented not just the possibility of justice for his daughter, but validation that his family's years of searching and advocacy had been worthwhile. Beth's mother, who had waited 8 years for answers, felt a complex mixture of anticipation and dread. She knew the trial would bring painful revelations about her daughter's final moments. The first week of testimony focused on establishing Coleman's pattern of behavior and introducing the physical evidence that connected him to all 7 victims. Detective Hayes took the stand to describe the investigation that had led from Emma and Jamie's disappearance to the discovery of multiple bodies. Her testimony was methodical and professional, walking the jury through the step-by-step process that had built the case against Coleman. She described the initial missing person reports, the discovery of Emma's bicycle, and the eventual finding of the bodies at both the Woodland site and Coleman's cabin. Witnesses from the Halloween dance testified about seeing both girls leave with Coleman. Former colleagues described his inappropriate behavior with students over many years. The mountain of evidence painted a picture of a predator who had hidden in plain sight. Coleman maintained his calm demeanor throughout the trial, occasionally taking notes and whispering with his attorneys. Even facing multiple murder charges, he seemed to believe he had been conducting legitimate educational work with troubled students. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 7 counts of first-degree murder. Coleman showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses and nodding slightly, as if approving of the jury's thorough consideration. During the sentencing phase, victim impact statements brought the courtroom to tears. Emma's mother spoke about the bright future her daughter would never have. Jamie's father described the empty chair at their dinner table. Beth's mother talked about 8 years of not knowing what had happened to her child. Coleman was sentenced to death for the murders of Emma and Jamie, and life imprisonment for the other 5 victims. As he was led away in shackles, he paused to look back at the families one last time, that same gentle teacher's smile crossing his face. The community of Millerville began a long process of healing after Coleman's conviction. New policies were implemented to protect students from predatory educators. Emma and Jamie's families established a foundation to support families of missing children. Coleman spent 12 years on death row before his execution in 2005. His final words were an apology to his victims' families, though many questioned the sincerity of his remorse. The case changed how Tennessee schools conducted background checks and monitored teacher-student interactions. It served as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, and that vigilance is the price of protecting innocent children. Today, a small memorial garden in Millerville Park honors Emma, Jamie, and all the victims of violence against children. Their stories serve as both a tragedy and a warning that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those we trust the most.